A sunny summer morning on the Eastern Front is just beginning. The damp dawn air has the spicy smell of earth and grass. But the sniper is not paying attention to the nature around him. He can't afford to be distracted by it right now. All his senses are tense. He resembles a predator stalking its prey. Looking through his binoculars, he is once again viewing the approaches to the Russian front line. Somewhere out there is the well-camouflaged position of his enemy, a Russian sniper who has killed 9 of his comrades in the last few days. This Russian must be a professional, because I've been searching for his position for 2 days now to no avail. But when this sniper's bullet struck the 9th gunman at dawn, I was overcome with confidence that I was able to determine the approximate direction from which the shot was fired. Here, at last, was the sign that would give away the enemy. Down near the edge of the shrubbery, tufts of grass were arranged in some unnatural way. My gaze focused on this point. Yes, this was where he had taken cover. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I recognized the indistinct features of a telescopic sight and a rifle barrel, the muzzle of which suddenly flashed. Stunned by the rumble of gunfire, I could see the bullet coming at me. I lay as if paralyzed and could not escape. With a thud, the bullet entered me right in the middle of my forehead, and my head and thoughts exploded in a flash of light. At that very moment I come to my senses, snapping out of a deep sleep. My heart is pounding frantically. I feel like I've just returned from a harsh 1944 to the present day. Slowly I force myself to pull myself together, but I don't even think about sleeping just a little longer. Through the open bedroom window I can hear the muffled sounds of the night and the air, as pleasant and fresh as it can only be at the beginning of summer. I get up, walk over to the window, and take a deep breath of night air into my constricted chest. After a few breaths in and out, I linger my gaze on the silhouette of the Salzburg Alps, over which hangs a disturbingly beautiful moon. As clear as the moon that hung over the Russian steppe in late summer, when the tiny train carrying replenishment, ammunition, and provisions for the front rumbled across the vast expanse. I remembered sitting at the open door of the carriage and being filled with intense impatience at the soldiers' approaching life. We were poor, reckless yellowbirds, I said to myself, and the past itself burst into my thoughts. As so many times before in all the years that had passed, episodes from my military life themselves arose before my eyes. Some of the events of 50 years ago came to mind as clearly as if they had happened yesterday. Born into a carpenter's family in September 1924, I grew up in a village in the federal state of Salzburg. I spent a carefree youth being raised on conservative values, such as patriotism, performance, loyalty to duty, and obedience to authority. It was the fact that these beliefs were so deeply embedded in me that allowed me to accept my future fate with such fatalism. I was going to follow in my father's footsteps in all things, and I was learning the carpenter's trade, so that one day I might be at the helm of the family business myself. I saw my upcoming military service as both a duty and an honor, as soldiers were highly respected in society. Military service was seen by young people as an exciting means of gaining life experience, giving them new grounds for self-esteem and a sense of accomplished maturity. I was a product of the social and political conditions of my time. My childhood was spent under the influence and control of the strict ideological policies of the Third Reich, which cultivated a sense of national consciousness, conservative ideals, and readiness for military service, especially among young men, in pursuit of its political goals. And it was natural for a young man of my age to volunteer for the Wehrmacht forces to support the aspirations of his government by force of arms. Nearly 3 years into the war, as the Wehrmacht marched from one victorious campaign to the next, many young men were literally afraid of missing their chance to take part in the fighting because, according to the propaganda of the time, the last victory was already in the visible distance. For the village youths, who knew nothing of the harsh and ruthless realities of war, the fall day in 1942, when they declared their impulse to enlist, was a source of special pride. The mayor made a short speech on service to the land of the fathers and the heroic struggle against Bolshevism. The orchestra of the fire brigade played cheerfully to them, and several beauties from the German Girls' Union pinned small bouquets on the lapels of the future heroes. The thought of being killed or disabled never crossed the minds of any of them, but 6 of the young men who proudly posed for the group portrait died in the 2 years that followed. It was still a long way off, however. A few months later, they arrived at the service, full of the brightest hopes. After finishing my studies, in January 1943, I, 18 years old, like almost all young men from my region, was conscripted into the Mountain Rifle Forces based in the Kufstein district in Tyrol. After receiving our equipment, my comrades and I were transferred 10 days later to Mittenwald for basic infantry training. After 6 months of grueling training, I became a machine gunner. Throughout my training, the subject of snipers as a tactical aspect of infantry combat was not mentioned at all. I only heard a few derogatory remarks about Russian snipers and women with shotguns, whom machine gunners must destroy with determination and ruthlessness. The preparations were heavy, but they were carried out without the fuss that one finds in an army in peacetime or in the early stages of war. On the contrary, everything was concentrated on preparing the young men, at least physically, for the difficulties they would encounter on the battlefield, and on teaching them a thorough knowledge of their weapons. In particular, instructors who had frontline experience tried to pass on the skills they had acquired in combat. They were aware of the dramatically high casualties among the new recruits sent to the front as reinforcements, who were immediately overwhelmed by the terrible reality of war. The unexpected ruthless brutality of combat exposed to the new recruits caused many of them to panic uncontrollably and want to run away. However, while such behavior might have saved them in the old days, in the age of sophisticated weapons of war that killed from a considerable distance, such behavior was fatal. Careful training helped prepare everyone for the moment of encounter with the enemy, but it did little to control the natural instinct to flee from danger. In the last minutes before the battle, even before it begins, everyone must decide for himself whether he can calmly face the war or not. It is then that it becomes clear who is a true warrior, for whom battle is second nature, and the battlefield is home, where one must forever face the choice of killing or being killed. Only from such a forge of military reality come snipers, soldiers who know how to keep their brains clear, who are able to act on the front line in the fire of battle, and who know how to wield their weapon, a rifle with a telescopic sight, with maximum effect. Only such soldiers are honored with the name sniper. I and my comrades were assigned to the 144th Mountain Rifle Regiment, which was then still in the southern part of the Eastern Front near Voroshilovsk. We were among one of the last replenishments sent to this regiment to restore it to full strength. But before being sent to the front, we were given 3 days' leave. True, these 3 days passed so quickly that we did not even have time to blink an eye. For many of us, it was the last opportunity in our young lives to see our families and say goodbye. During that brief meeting with our families, the future seemed uncertain. My mother stroked my head at every opportunity and tried in every way to show concern for me. My father, a soldier in World War I, hid his anxiety behind silence and hard work. But now came the inevitable day of parting. When I entered the bus that was to take me back to the Mittenwald barracks, my mother was in tears. My father hugged me, saying goodbye, though he had never done so before, and hardly keeping his cool, whispered in my ear, "Take care of yourself, boy. My greatest wish is that you return unharmed, but that's in God's hands." As the bus moved off, I only waved once to my parents and turned away abruptly with a frozen expression on my face. Otherwise, I would have lost my composure, which I already had a hard time maintaining. The Germans were anxiously observing that in the area of the 3rd Mountain Division, the Red Army, reinforced by the arriving supplies of new American weapons, was preparing for a major offensive on the Donetsk Basin and Ukraine. Consequently, every man who increased the combat strength of the German units was welcomed in them. My companions and I spent many days traveling across the endless Russian steppe in straw-covered cattle cars before we reached our destination, the Donetsk Basin. Our arrival at Voroshilovsk coincided with the beginning of the Russian attack. Without giving us the slightest chance to adapt to frontline life, the day after our arrival, we were thrown into the battle for Redkino Gorge, which proved incredibly difficult and inflicted considerable casualties. Compared to the average infantryman, I had a really hard fate, because the 3rd Mountain Division had to operate in unnatural conditions for this kind of troops in the southern sector of the Eastern Front until the very end of the war, always being in the thick of the fighting. The losses in its units were almost unbelievable. Proportionately, they were much higher than the losses in the rest of the army. The Donetsk Basin, with its huge coal reserves, was an important raw material extraction region, and was therefore crucial for both opposing sides. The coal mines with their gigantic tunnel system were not completely cleared of enemy troops by the advancing Germans. Behind the backs of the Wehrmacht troops remained entire Russian units hidden in the tunnels, which then attacked unsuspecting German infantrymen. This resulted in bloody close battles that could continue even in the tunnels. The Soviets had managed to break through the German defense lines with a vigorous attack before I reached the front. They were now seeking to expand the bridgehead they had occupied. The commander of the 3rd Mountain Division assessed the situation as very precarious, and therefore launched a counterattack without further preparation or regrouping of his forces. This resulted in success, but the victory was bought at the cost of huge infantry casualties. I and other riflemen in training with me arrived at our destination at dawn on July 18, 1943. We approached the location of the unit in silence. We were pensive. Anxiety and nervousness were written on our faces. Everyone who met us on the way had their own way of coping with the fear they had found earlier. Experienced fighters chewed crusts of bread with a grim expression, or smoked, or simply forced themselves to collect themselves so that their faces did not reflect any emotion. But the recruits found it much harder to overcome their nervousness. We were tense and restless. Many of us felt nauseous to no end. Not knowing from experience what was to happen next, I perceived the strange scenes of what was happening, clearly feeling fear. I could not even eat. My stomach rebelled against any food, and my body shook like jelly. I could not move from my seat. But in this critical situation, I was lucky. The commander of my squad was a very experienced and battle-hardened man, but he was also attentive and sympathetic to newcomers to his unit. He saw how scared I was and told me, trying to encourage me, "Breathe deep, boy. Think only of your machine gun and shoot like you've been trained. Pay attention to me and my orders. I take care of my boys, and if you're in real trouble, I'll be there for you. I've gotten my unit out of every mess so far. We're not leaving any of our own behind." The combination of youthful naivety that was still in me and the trust that immediately caused me the commander of our group allowed me to find the strength to overcome anxiety together. This helped me to endure among the events that accompanied my baptism of fire. It was almost 5:00 when the mountain gunners began a counterattack. It began with the fire of German artillery placed behind the positions occupied by me and other soldiers. The riflemen had a clear view of the terrain in front of them as huge clods of earth broke away from the ground with a deafening, heavy sound, soaring in fountains into the clear morning sky. It was unpleasant to hear these sounds, which were entirely new to me, mingling with the endless rattle of gunfire and the howl of shrapnel. I and the other riflemen crouched on the ground in our positions and waited with bated breath for the order to attack. The artillery preparation lasted about 20 minutes. When the guns fell silent, I suddenly caught a strange sound. It was the beastly yelling of the wounded Russians. The order to attack was given as the terror began to grow more and more intense within me. All the tension and nervousness suddenly transformed into one continuous movement around me. The whirlwind of the battle, which had begun so bloodily, began to draw the German infantrymen into its vortex as well. Suddenly, Russian grenades began to explode in our positions. As soon as I jumped up, I immediately heard a whirring sound followed by a burst. To my right, a comrade, a young fellow of the same age as me from Berchtesgaden, was staring studiedly at his torn uniform jacket. through the hole in which his intestines were spilling out more and more every second. After a few seconds of shock, the guy started screaming, trying to shove his guts back in. I wanted to help him. He lowered his machine gun, but the squad leader immediately slapped him on the back and yelled, "Forward! Attack! He can't be helped. Cover your comrades with fire." When I came out of my stupor, the wounded man suddenly fell silent, knelt down with a strange frozen look, and collapsed headlong to the ground. But I was already 20 meters away from him and did not see it. Thoughts flew out of my head. I was guided by the primitive will to survive. Death, injury, and fear lost all meaning. My consciousness narrowed to shooting, reloading weapons, dashing forward, seeking cover, and pointing a machine gun at enemies. I became an animal fighting for my life. During the fight, not for life, but for death, a naive young man turned into a warrior in the original sense of the word. The mixture of fear, blood, and death affected me like a drug that is intoxicating on the one hand, but depressing on the other, because not only does it mark the crossing of the line beyond which human innocence ends, but it also takes away the hopes for the future. Killing has become a craft that has taken hold of me, and it was fate's will that I should attain the highest skill in it. Our group cautiously made their way through the bushes until they were ambushed. The enemy was hiding at a distance of about 20 meters. One of our riflemen fell without a word from a hail of sudden machine gun bursts. At the same second, I returned fire from my handheld machine gun, and the rest of the soldiers from our group were able to lie down in cover. Then they pelted the enemy position with hand grenades and rushed forward, covering each other with fire, but the enemy seemed to vaporize. A little ahead, in a dense bush, they found 4 dead Russians lying in front of a masterfully camouflaged mine entrance. The dead looked extremely emaciated and pale. They had probably been hiding in the tunnel for months. Fresh footprints led to the mine. Curiosity prompted a few of the gunners to go in. With carbines at the ready, they disappeared underground. A few minutes later, I heard the muffled sounds of gunfire from deep inside the mine. Soon afterward, the German soldiers, staggering, came out. They were dead pale and confused, but there was no time left to ask questions. The sector was attacked by a company of Russians, and the riflemen were seized by the whirlpool of battle. The unrelenting confrontation continued until dusk, which came about 10 o'clock in the evening. It seemed to me a miracle that I, unlike many of my comrades, had survived the day. My company was now withdrawing back to the positions from which the morning attack had begun. Because of the underestimation of the Russian resistance, the attack had to be launched again the next day. Both sides were given the opportunity to regroup. The respite was used to examine and dress the minor wounds of those who remained able to continue fighting, and to bring provisions and ammunition to the physicians. Sitting with a crust of bread, a can of canned fish, and a cigarette, the German fighters talked about the most important events of the day. This was the first opportunity for me to ask my surviving comrades about what had happened in the tunnel after all. In short sentences, still clearly in shock at what they had seen, 2 of the surviving gunmen recounted an incredible incident. But perhaps unbelievable incidents of this kind happened every day in that war. Fumbling their way in the semi-darkness of the tunnel, after about 50 meters, they found a barely discernible notch in the wall, from where the stench was unbearable. It took them some time to get used to the darkness. Then a horrifying picture appeared before them. 2 Russians were squatting side by side in the corner, and not far from them were the carefully preserved remains of 2 human bodies lying on ammunition boxes. They had been preserved by evidently smoking them over a fire. In another corner behind a pile of excrement lay their entrails, which had already begun to decompose, and nibbled bones. Shaking with disgust, one of the riflemen, who could speak a little Russian, asked the 2 survivors what had happened. They replied that they, 35 men, had been left in this tunnel as the Russians retreated, with strict instructions to stay in cover and hold their positions until the Red Army counterattacked. Month after month went by, but the counterattack did not begin, and they very soon ran out of all food. The officer who remained with them, nevertheless insisted that they follow orders. And when many of the soldiers began to demand an immediate retreat, he shot the two youngest, they were only 16 years old, to hold the others back. He killed them in cold blood with shots to the neck, and then at gunpoint ordered the others to gut them, dismember the bodies, and smoke them over a fire. He forced the soldiers to split the livers of the corpses and eat them raw. For the next few weeks, they felt like people who had transgressed human law. And they didn't even think of resisting the officer because their sergeant and two junior sergeants were on his side and guarded all the gun cases. In time, the bodies were eaten, and the officer mercilessly shot another youngest soldier. A few days afterward, an attack by the Russians repulsed the tunnel, which obliged the group to go into action. While the gunner, who knew Russian, was translating this account to the others, another German soldier began to vomit from the disgust that overwhelmed him. When he could breathe again, he shouted, "You dirty bastards," and fired his MP-400 and one submachine gun. They couldn't believe it. Panic in their eyes, both Russians stared at their bullet-riddled bodies until blood foamed from their cracked, already silent lips. Their bodies shuddered one last time, and lives were cut short. "Let's get out of here, guys," the squad leader yelled, and they rushed back, leaving this nightmare. Once out of the tunnel, they couldn't get enough of the fresh air. For experienced German infantrymen, this was just one episode of war, but I was overwhelmed by the flood of emotions that overwhelmed me. The first day at the front was unlike anything I had experienced before, and if it was nothing more than a harmless prelude to the vices of war, what would happen next? But there was no time to develop the thought. The desire for sleep and hunger were taking their toll, and there were only a few hours to rest. In the end, it took the Germans 4 days to break the Soviet resistance. They had to bring in additional artillery and assault guns. A piece of conquered Russian soil cost the lives of 650 German soldiers. At the end of 5 days, I had lost the last vestiges of my youthful naivete. The experience of bloody fighting had taken its toll on my face, so that I now looked 10 years older. Our 7th Company was reduced in number to only 20 men. Of my group, only I and our company commander were left alive. I had lost my sense of time, and no longer felt fear or pity. I became a product of the events happening around me, driven by a primitive instinct to survive amidst the grueling fighting, hunger, and thirst. In the end, it took the Germans 4 days to break Soviet resistance. They had to bring in additional artillery and assault guns to do so. A piece of conquered Russian land cost the lives of 650 German soldiers. At the end of 5 days, I had lost the last vestiges of my youthful naivete. The experience of bloody fighting had taken its toll on my face, so that I now looked 10 years older. Our 7th Company was reduced in number to only 20 men. Of my group, only I and our company commander were left alive. I had lost my sense of time, and no longer felt fear or pity. I became a product of the events happening around me, driven by the primitive instinct to survive amidst the grueling fighting, hunger, and thirst. On July 22, the Wehrmacht's struggle to restore the former German front line achieved results, but the Russians fought with desperate courage. Well camouflaged, they often displayed unusual fire practice, firing only from less than 50 meters away. Thus, virtually every shot hit the target. The Russian snipers, in particular, engendered confidence that the German gunners would soon be annihilated. I was pressed by the realization that my combat specialization was suicidal like no other. The strategic importance of machine guns inevitably meant that they were subjected to the fierce fire of heavy weapons, such as mortars and infantry guns, and especially in mobile combat, snipers. As a result, the casualty rate among machine gunners was much higher than among other fighters. It became clear to me already in the first days at the front that my chances of survival depended directly on whether I could take another place in my company. When it was the 5th day of fighting, I heard a thud on my left, and a shell fragment entered my left arm. I met the wound with cold fatalism, as an inevitable consequence of war. Surprisingly, The wound did not hurt and bled faintly. I tried to bend my arm and was reassured. It seemed intact. I crawled back with my machine gun, pulled out a pack of bandages, and with the help of a comrade, bandaged the laceration on the hand at the base of the thumb. Barely had I finished dressing it when my fellow soldier shouted, "Zappy, look, they're coming. Shoot, shoot." An hour later, when the company had moved away from the front line, and there was some time to rest, I finally felt the pain. At the muster station, which also served as a basic supply and ammunition depot, a doctor and several nurses were treating the wounded. I went there to have my wound examined. The makeshift hospital was located near the regimental headquarters in a small thatched-roofed hut. Without a single emotion, I listened to the moans, howls, and screams. The smell of rotting flesh did not make me nauseous now. One of the medics was sorting the arrivals according to the severity of their wounds. A very young soldier was brought in on a cloak tent. I looked at his face first. Monotonous moans were coming out of the soldier's throat. "I can't move. God, I can't move." My gaze froze on the wounded man's body. It was twitching like a marionette. The medical surgeon lifted the soldier who had been brought in and examined his chest. There was no damage on the front, but between the shoulder blades was a gaping hole that could fit 2 hands. Shrapnel from his ribs and spine was visible. The medical surgeon carefully laid the wounded man back on the cloak tent. He said, "Guys, we can't help this guy. Death for him will be the most merciful at this wound. Take him to the priest's barn." All the hopeless were carried to the barn, where the chaplain, obviously overwhelmed by grief, tried to provide the mortally wounded with what modest comfort he could. My wound was assessed as not serious, so I had to wait in line to be seen by a medical surgeon who expertly cleaned dirt and sewed open wounds. Behind me sat a surgeon whose right forearm was bound with a handkerchief, stretched with a stick like a tourniquet. His nearly severed arm swayed on the last remaining tendons like ropes. He stared motionless at the floor, in a state of shock. It was another 3 hours before my turn finally came. Without a word, the medical surgeon removed the bandage, examined the wound for foreign bodies, and then disinfected it with a sulfonamide solution. With great physical strength, the medical lance corporal grabbed my arm and turned his back to me, blocking my view of the wound. As soon as he did so, the surgeon without anesthesia began quickly and skillfully, scraping away the dirt, trimming the edges of the wound and sewing it up. Holding my hand with a steely grip, the lance corporal said, "Ori, if you want to, this will shut off your consciousness from the pain." And I felt myself losing control, overwhelmed by the pain. My screams seemed to express all the inhuman ordeals I had endured over the past few days. I was supposed to rest while my wound healed, so I was transferred to the regimental transport unit for 14 days, along with other soldiers who were also lightly wounded. We were ordered to do light auxiliary work. During this period, the regiment, which had suffered heavy losses, moved back to Voroshilovsk for replenishment with men and matcha stuff. I, as you remember, had worked as a carpenter before the war, and so I was assigned as assistant non-commissioned officer in arms. I was tasked with sorting captured weapons, and as soon as I got up to speed, mending the butts of damaged German carbines. It was here in the relative safety of the regimental headquarters that, after reflecting on the situation, I firmly decided to try to avoid service as a machine gunner at the earliest opportunity. Of course, it was a sign of fate that among the weapons I was sorting through I found a single Russian sniper rifle. Just seeing it, I hurriedly asked the non-commissioned weapons officer if I could practice with it. They had plenty of Russian ammunition, and the non-commissioned officer suddenly felt that the man in front of him was the right man for such a job. He said, "Show me what you can do. Maybe you were born to be a sniper. We need guys like that to give the Ivans a good beating. You know what a nightmare their snipers have made our lives." I started practicing that same night. After a few days, it became clear I was a natural sniper. The non-commissioned officer of arms was impressed with my shooting skills. Without any apparent effort, I could hit a matchbox from 100 meters, and from 300 meters, A wooden cartridge box, measuring 30 by 30 centimeters. Show me what you can do. Maybe you were born to be a sniper. We need guys like that to give the Ivans a good beating. You know what a nightmare their snipers have made our lives. I started practicing that same night. After a few days, it became clear I was a natural sniper. The non-commissioned officer of arms was impressed with my shooting skills. Without any apparent effort, I could hit a matchbox from 100 meters, and from 300, a wooden cartridge box, measuring 30 by 30 centimeters. 14 days of rest passed quickly, my wound was healing, and it was time for me to return to my company. When I said goodbye to the non-commissioned weapons officer, he handed me a rifle with a telescopic sight. Zap, I talked to your old man. That's what experienced soldiers called their company commanders. He doesn't mind if you try your luck as a sniper. Come on, my boy, show the Ivans. In the first days of August 1943, I returned to my company with a sniper rifle in my hands. When I reported to the sergeant about my arrival, he handed me without ceremony a black wounded badge too, along with my award papers. Allerberg, I hope you don't think this is the end of it, the sergeant told me. It was just the beginning. Keep your ass close to the ground, especially now that you're a sniper. Now go and give the Ivans a good thrashing. The front was relatively quiet. The fighting had been reduced to minor artillery duels and skirmishes between units out on reconnaissance. But at the same time, because of the Russian snipers, every German soldier felt incredible tension. It was very dangerous even just to stick out of a trench in the immediate vicinity of the front line. Against all precautions, the Russians found targets again and again. In my commander, I found a wise mentor who understood the benefits of snipers to the troops and lamented their absence in the German army. However, this view was not widespread. Many officers perceived snipers as dishonorable, treacherous killers and refused to use them. One officer of the 3rd Mountain Division reflected this attitude quite concretely in his memoirs. Each of these thugs crawls out at dawn or before dusk and lies motionless, watching the enemy positions like a cat over a mouse hole. And then only a shoulder or a head will emerge from the trench for a moment. But even a moment is enough. A shot breaks the silence. An empty tin can falls out of his cramped hand. Such is the price of human life for a sniper. Such is war. Here it is necessary to make a small explanation. While in the trenches, the soldiers are faced with the need to go to their natural needs. For hygienic reasons, they cannot litter the trenches with excrement. Therefore, after a few days at the front, every German infantryman adapted to use empty tin cans as a toilet. Once the can was filled, the odor emanating from it and the grumbling of their comrades encouraged the soldiers to dispose of their contents. This was done by spilling the can over the edge of the trench. Inexperienced soldiers sometimes lifted themselves too high for fear of dirtying the trench. A good sniper could not but use such an opportunity for an accurate shot without feeling any remorse. However, the remark at the end of the officer's comments above is fair enough. War cannot be ethical or heroic. It is a means of achieving a political goal through maximum violence, the price of which is death, injury, and destruction. Accordingly, it makes absolutely no difference whether you are killed by a sniper's bullet or by the splinter of a mine fired from a mortar. And if you look at things from this point of view, it is inappropriate to talk about honor, all the more so because it begs a logical question. Who is more honorable and courageous in battle? An officer who, for example, sends an entire company into a bloody meat grinder in the name of achieving some strategic goal, for the sake of personal glory, or as a result of tactical incompetence, or a sniper who is, so to speak, cunning, but highly effective in fighting the enemy, and who constantly exposes himself to considerable risk. Either way, I avoided a suicidal return to the ranks as a machine gunner. I now reported directly to the company commander. By this point, the combat situation was such that the company was mainly engaged in holding its own positions, and the commander allowed me to go hunting within the area occupied by our company. Instinctively, I felt where to begin to act, and went around the trenches to ask my comrades about what they had seen around. I was greeted with enthusiasm. At last we have a sniper. Show them what you can do, Zap. The machine gun team commander took me by the sleeve and led me into a covered trench, through a gap between the massive logs that lined the edges of the trench to protect me from enemy bullets and shell splinters. He showed me the Russian positions and explained, "There's a sniper out there somewhere. He's shooting at anything that looks suspicious to him. Look at this, even the dishes we lifted over the trench have bullet holes in them. Can you get rid of him?" Stretching my eyes through 8 times binoculars, inciting to destroy the enemy, I was given to me by the sergeant in charge of supplying the company. I looked at the surrounding area through a small hole between the logs, but could not see anything special. Then I asked him to carefully raise a cloak tent with a cap on it over the edge of the trench, hoping in this way to track down the Russian sniper. The latter turned out to be rather unsophisticated in his business and fired. Scarcely had the cap appeared above the edge of the trench. I saw a flash on the muzzle of the enemy's rifle barrel, flashed like a gust of wind from behind a pile of fallen trees. Now that I knew where the Russian sniper was hiding, I could finally take out my telescopic sight, which I had hidden before, so that the glare from its lenses would not attract the enemy before the time. Thus, having already gone sniper hunting for the first time, I intuitively felt one of the most important features of my new craft. Unlike my opponent, I understood the first law of survival. Don't shoot at a target you haven't accurately identified, and to shoot only once from one position, and then immediately change it or become invisible within its confines. My opponent stayed in his position and waited for a new target. It was a fatal mistake for which he had to pay with his life. I carefully placed a twisted raincoat in front of the logs to rest on, and carefully poked the barrel of my rifle into the gap. I could not use my telescopic sight, for the slit was too narrow, but the Russian lay only 90 meters away from me, and it was possible to aim in the usual way, using the front sight and the aiming bar. My opponent remained in his position and waited for a new target. It was a fatal mistake for which he had to pay with his life. I carefully placed a twisted raincoat in front of the logs to rest on, and carefully poked the barrel of my rifle into the gap. I could not use my telescopic sight, for the slit was too narrow, but the Russian lay only 90 meters away from me, and it was possible to aim in the usual way, using the front sight and the aiming bar. Suddenly, I became nervous. My comrades were expecting a perfect shot, and I suddenly realized that for the first time in my life, I had to kill a man in cold blood and calculatingly. My resolve was shaken by doubt. My throat was dry, my heart was racing, and my hands trembled. I felt paralyzed and unable to pull the trigger. I had to put the rifle down and take a few deep breaths to regain consciousness. My comrades stood around me and stared at me intently. I raised my rifle back into firing position and again felt hesitation. All right, now what? Give him a beating. As if from afar, I heard the voice of a comrade. And at that moment I regained my composure. As if in a dream, with the precision of a machine, my index finger was on the trigger itself. I tensed up, took a deep inhalation and exhalation, held my breath, and pulled the trigger. A shot rang out. Because of the dust in front of me, I couldn't see if I had hit or not, but my comrade, who was looking through another gap between the logs, shouted, "You got him, boy. Excellent shot. That pig is dead." Like a fire in the bush, the news spread through the trenches. The Russian sniper was finished. Suddenly, there were machine gun bursts and rifle shots. Someone shouted, "Attack!" Amazed by such an unexpected German assault, the Russians began to hastily leave their forward trenches and retreat to their main line of defense. Meeting no resistance, the German riflemen stormed the abandoned positions. I was among them. I and the witnesses to my first shot wanted to see the results. We ran up to a pile of fallen trees, behind which the Russian sniper was hiding. It turned out that there he had dug a hollow like a trench, in which his lifeless body now lay. The sniper's head and torso were drenched in blood. Grabbing him by the ankles, The two riflemen pulled him out to see exactly where the fatal wound was. A bloody mess of brains and bone fragments covered the sniper's back. There was a hole in the back of the Russian's head the size of a fist, so that through it they could look inside his skull, which was empty because of the bullet that had torn it apart. The experienced fighters, used to this sort of thing, turned him over on his back to look at the face of the dead man, who appeared to be a boy, perhaps only 16 years of age. My bullet had entered his right eye. "You got a clear shot of him, kid. And you did it from almost 100 meters without a telescopic sight. You did a really good job, Zap," said one of the shooters. I looked down at my victim with a mixture of pride, horror, and guilt. Suddenly, I felt a lump come up to my throat, and I felt nauseous. Belching convulsively, I spewed out a mixture of bread, malted coffee, and sardines. Although I was ashamed of such a public display of weakness, my comrades were warm and understanding of the fact that I had lost control of myself at this point. A sergeant with a large reddish mustache and a roguish, mischievous glint in his blue eyes, who was a head and a half taller than me and about 10 years older, encouraged me in a cheerful voice with a North German accent. "You have nothing to be ashamed of, my boy. It has happened to all of us. And you had to go through it too. It's better to throw up than to shit your pants. And Daddy's always got some hot liquor for such occasions," he said, pulling out a shiny silver flask from his breast pocket. "Take a big gulp. It'll make it easier to get it all out of your head. Just make sure the rest of your vomit doesn't get into my flask, or I'll rip your head off." I took a big gulp gratefully. As I handed the flask back to the sergeant, I suddenly thought, this guy looks like a Viking, except for the horns on his helmet, and I couldn't help smiling as I pictured a Viking among the mountain infantry. But there was no time for reflection and personal feelings, because while we were searching the trenches left by the Russians, hoping to find useful trophies, the Soviet soldiers counterattacked. The Germans were driven back as quickly as they had driven the Russians back before. In an hour everything was back to square one, and everyone was in their original positions, but I had passed my sniper's examination, and my comrades were telling everyone about my success. The praise showered on me from all sides helped me to get rid of my doubts about what I had done. I firmly learned the second lesson. War is a ruthless thing, and you can either kill or be killed. In combat, having compassion for your enemy is sure suicide, because every enemy you don't kill will kill you in the next second. Your chances of survival increase in direct proportion to your military skills and your lack of compassion for the enemy. That's the principle I followed for the rest of the war. If the enemy was in my sights and my finger was on the trigger, the enemy's fate was sealed. No exceptions. That same day I managed to shoot 2 more carefree Russian soldiers. Full of youthful pride, I made 3 notches on the butt of my rifle with a penknife. I followed this ritual the entire time I had my Russian rifle with telescopic sight with me. I maintained this suicidal habit until my comrade tragically died the following year. Right after my first successes, the sergeant told me that I had to report my lucky shots to company headquarters, each time naming witnesses to my hits from among the NCOs or officers, but only those hits that I made while firing alone, not during a general attack or defense of a position counted. I had to keep a little book with my sniper score, and an officer or NCO had to confirm whenever that score was increased. For every 10 hits I scored, I was awarded a silver patch, 7 centimeters long and 1 wide, like those on the collars of sergeants. Such patches were worn on the left forearm. But getting confirmation of hits was exhausting. Some of my commanders were jealous of my success and refused to sign my name. This happened especially often if my hits were observed by artillery gunners, who in most cases were young officers full of military idealism. They considered snipers to be dirty killers and expressed their antipathy by refusing to confirm their hits. Another reason why relations between snipers and artillerymen were strained was that snipers were in the habit of stealing better artillerymen's uniforms than their own. In particular, jackets, capes, and raincoats. I became the master of such unofficial acquisition of officers' uniforms. Over the next 14 days, my sniper shots reached their target 27 times, and my new specialty quickly became routine. As a rookie, I was nevertheless exceptionally lucky, as Russian snipers avoided me, unaware that I was not really a professional. The part of the front where my company was located remained relatively quiet. This gave me the opportunity to learn from my own experience and my own mistakes. Most novice snipers did not have such an opportunity, and they often paid for their mistakes with their lives. However, this quiet period soon came to an end. On August 18, 1943, after Russian pressure had been building for several days, the Soviets launched a massive attack along the entire length of the Donetsk front. Thanks to a crushing superiority in numbers of fighters, the Russians were able to break through the German defense lines, and the Wehrmacht infantry were forced to abandon their positions. Now that the Germans were on the defensive, the true tactical value of a good sniper became clear to them. Although I had only been at the front for a few weeks, I already possessed the determination and coolness of an experienced warrior. Even in desperate situations, I kept my nerves in check. In battles I fought with inspiration, and I was lucky, and this is impossible to develop even during the best training. Only in real battles is a real soldier able to control this fear and possess the innate reflexes necessary for survival. The 3rd Mountain Division began its methodical retreat to the Dnieper, with a significant superiority, 33 fully manned divisions against only 10 depleted fighting formations on the German side. The Russians stormed the Wehrmacht positions with only 90 German soldiers for every kilometer of front line. Gaps in the defense were closed by deploying second lines of defense and bringing in men from the rear services. Accordingly, the Germans had no unused units and reserves. As a result, the Soviet breakthrough had immediate and extremely dangerous consequences. The 3rd Mountain Division found itself in the center of the heaviest fighting near Zaporozhye, where 2 Russian wedges were trying to break through and capture the German troops in a pincer. However, the riflemen of the 144th Mountain Infantry Regiment held an important strategic position and, facing a tenfold superior enemy, held it, allowing the rest of the units to retreat in an orderly fashion and create a new line of defense. In early September, the roads had become a knee-deep swamp of mud due to the heavy rains of early fall. Constant lack of sleep, problems with provisions and ammunition, and the unrelenting pressure of the fighting were depleting the last reserves of strength of the German soldiers. This situation became typical at the end of the war. My company was ordered to cover the regiment's retreat. Its 60 riflemen were stationed in a village near strategically important crossroads to delay the advance of the Russian advanced mechanized troops. Soviet intelligence quickly established the number of riflemen, after which Russian units were sent to destroy them. However, the men of the 7th Company who remained in the village were experienced soldiers. They were well entrenched and were able to conduct accurate fire lying down, thanks to which they managed to keep the Russians at a considerable distance for some time. At the same time, the German soldiers even withstood the fire of small artillery pieces and tanks, suffering only minor casualties. In battles like this, snipers proved their valor. Shot after shot, I hit my targets from a distance of 300 meters, forcing the enemy to constantly seek cover from my consistently accurate hits. The ability to shake the enemy's morale in such a desperate struggle was crucial. An experienced sniper does not necessarily try to kill his victim, but rather aims to hit the torso so that the wound is extremely painful and the enemy is unable to continue fighting. This allows the sniper not only to hit the maximum number of enemies in the mad confusion of battle, but also to have a psychological effect on the enemy. More than once I saw how the inhuman screams of Russian fighters wounded by me demoralized their comrades, and the Soviet attack abruptly weakened and stopped. It was in these battles with superior enemy forces that I developed my personal sniper tactics to perfection. I paid no attention to the first 3 or 4 lines of attackers and tried to hit in the stomach as many of the fighters advancing behind them as possible. Hearing the piercing cries of the wounded behind me, the front-line attackers would lose their presence of mind, and the attack would begin to falter. At this point, I turned my attention to the first lines of the enemy. The enemy, who were closer than 50 meters to me, I killed with accurate shots in the head or heart, trying in this way to instantly take out of the battle all those who could. To those of the Russians who were more than 50 meters away from me, on the contrary, I fired into the torso, endeavoring to wound as many of the enemy as possible. When the Russians were fleeing, the shots that struck the retreating men in the kidney area were particularly effective. In these cases, the wounded began to literally animal-like screaming and howling. As a result, the attack often ended abruptly. In such situations, I sometimes managed to hit more than 20 enemies in a few minutes. However, such hits did not increase my sniper score. For 2 days, my actions helped to hold our company, but its numbers continued to steadily decline, and we still had to retreat to avoid imminent annihilation. On the second night, the 7th Company leaked into a gap in the Russian troops, which we managed to create at dusk. With themselves, the German fighters carried away 13 wounded. Again, it was the sniper who kept the pursuing enemies at a respectful distance until the group reached the new German defense lines at dawn. Perhaps the modern reader can still think of some ethics and soldierly honor in such battles. But there, in the bloody meat grinder, everyone was guided solely by how to survive himself and help his comrades survive. Even after the 7th Company reached its own, its men had no time to think about a well-deserved rest. As the new day began, the Russians again launched an attack. It was more cautious, and its reflection required from the Germans a full strain of effort. This time, in the front line of the Russian offensive, along with the infantry, were 3 tanks. I prepared myself a well-camouflaged position among my comrades and hoped that the enemy would not be able to determine my location for a long time. The rest of the German infantrymen also camouflaged their new trenches as well as they could, hoping to take the Russians by surprise. But the Russians, too, not knowing what they would encounter, advanced cautiously. Even after the 7th Company reached their own, its men had no time to think about a well-deserved rest. As the new day began, the Russians again launched an attack. It was more cautious, and its reflection required from the Germans a full strain of effort. This time, in the front line of the Russian offensive, along with the infantry, were 3 tanks. I prepared myself a well-camouflaged position among my comrades and hoped that the enemy would not be able to determine my location for a long time. The rest of the German infantrymen also camouflaged their new trenches as well as they could, hoping to take the Russians by surprise. But the Russians, too, not knowing what they would encounter, advanced cautiously. The Soviet infantry took cover behind their slow-moving tanks, which were now about 150 meters from the German positions. The first tank jerked abruptly to a halt, and its turret began to turn with a whirring sound, aiming its cannon in the direction of the German defense lines. The Russians, however, had not yet pinpointed the exact location of the enemy. The turret stopped, and a few seconds later the hatch opened. I already had my rifle in firing position, and my telescopic sight was aimed at the hatch cover, which was open only 2 palms wide. A head with binoculars peeked out cautiously from there. My rifle was aimed for a hit at about 120 meters. I calculated that I needed to take a couple of centimeters higher so that the bullet would enter the tanker's head. A direct hit in this case was my duty, because it was my shot that was to be the signal to start the battle. For a few seconds I hesitated, but then the thought occurred to me that I was aiming at the commander of the tank, and possibly of the entire attack. His death could decide the outcome of the entire battle. A deep breath, a moment to concentrate, and my finger quietly and firmly pressed the trigger. A shot rang out. Through the telescopic sight, I saw blood splatter on the hatch cover, and the head disappeared into the depths of the tank. A few seconds later, the battle broke out, but the tanks didn't move. They only fired in the direction of the German positions without doing any damage to them. A few minutes later, their engines roared, and the 3 steel colossi retreated. My assumption was probably correct. The Russian attack had evidently been left unguided, and when about an hour later the enemy tried to attack the German positions again, his actions lacked the necessary pressure and determination. A single shot, made after careful aiming, demoralized the enemy, and it may well have been this that allowed the German riflemen to hold out. On September 20, the Russian offensive came to a halt. The German front, the length of which by that time had shrunk, was not strong enough. But thanks to the high morale of the 3rd Mountain Division, the Soviet breakthrough was prevented. However, in doing so, the 144th Mountain Infantry Regiment lost more than half of its soldiers. The surviving soldiers were exhausted, dirty, suffering from lice, wounded, and sick. On their faces appeared deep traces of the inhuman trials they had endured. The fascist propaganda machine cynically called it the heroic appearance of the soldiers of the Eastern Front, forged in the fire of battle. Surprisingly, I didn't have a scratch on me. I was plagued only by lice and diarrhea, which resulted from the fact that I, like many of my comrades, for many days ate mostly pickles that we found in abandoned village houses. The division used the temporary respite in fighting to reinforce the new defense line, Wotenstellung. At the new location, the Wehrmacht soldiers felt a special feeling, as if they were at home, since this area had recently been inhabited by Volga Germans who had been sent here by the Russians many years before. And here, among the neat little villages and small towns with names like Heidelberg, Tiefenbrunn, and Rosenberg, where all the houses are neat and tidy, and the cupboards are filled with pottery, and everything looks as if the owners would return at any moment, they had to build field fortifications, knowing that in a few days or perhaps weeks the storm of war would hit them. What was happening began to seem to many like a bad omen. A strange premonition settled in the souls of the soldiers that a similar threat was looming over their own homes. While the Red Army was preparing for a new offensive, the 144th Mountain Infantry Regiment received a completely inappropriate modest replenishment of soldiers returning from vacation or from the hospital. The amount of weapons and ammunition they received was also not in line with expectations. The most important tasks were to make sure that the entire sector occupied by the regiment was cleared of the enemy, to accurately predict where the enemy would launch a new attack, and to intelligently distribute their own very limited forces. It was also important to mislead the enemy as to the strength of the German forces by sending out patrols of considerable size. In the early hours of the morning and into the evenings, I would sneak outside the German positions to discourage and confuse the carefree soldiers of the Russian patrols, reducing their numbers with unexpected precision shots and fleeing to their own positions the bereft surviving Soviet fighters. Patrols were not expected to encounter a lone sniper at such a distance from the defense lines, and in such encounters the sniper's shots fell on both sides' patrols like a thunderclap. That's why I often managed to kill several soldiers on patrol before they could find cover or retreat to a safe distance. At first light on a lovely morning in late September, I was lying well camouflaged on the top of a small hill overgrown with trees. I was looking over the Russian artillery positions, which were about a kilometer away, when a Russian patrol appeared directly in front of me at a distance of about 150 meters. Led by a very young lieutenant, the group was marching in single file. The soldiers were walking too close to each other, carelessness written on their faces. Keeping my composure, I very carefully moved my rifle into firing position, so as not to give away my location. I was surprised to see such inexperienced action by the patrol. As always, the first thing I did was to catch the officer in the telescopic sight, and my breath caught, for I could guess from his clothing that he was somehow a member of the Russian political elite. It looked highly unusual, but the Russian commander was wearing a special cut uniform of the finest quality cloth and excellent boots of the finest leather. As I stared stunned and kept my finger on the trigger, I saw that the lieutenant had tripped over a tree root. Relaxing my finger, I watched as the Russian stood up and pulled a white embroidered handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his hands in uniform. I, who had lived amidst the filth, stench, lice, and daily brutal struggle for survival, had mixed feelings about what was happening. It seemed absurd, and at the same time made me long for a time of peace. But war leaves no room for sentimentality. By sparing this patrol, I was putting myself and my comrades in immediate danger. Looking through the telescopic sight at the lieutenant carefully shaking off his handkerchief, folding it, and dropping it back into his pocket, I caught the officer's right breast pocket in the crosshairs of my scope. What was happening was beginning to resemble some kind of mystical act. The approaching assassination was turning into a ritual, filled with the poetry of the inevitable transience of existence, and as if coming from the Japanese samurai code Bushido. With incredible ease, I felt that the decisive moment had come, concentrated, and, smiling inwardly, pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot broke the dawn silence, and the young officer stared at the hole on his chest, from which a small fountain of blood spurted, shocked, and still not believing it had happened. While his soldiers, screaming loudly, scattered in different directions, the lieutenant fell to his knees without a sound and collapsed into the bushes, staring up at the sky with his already empty eyes. After 2 of his men had paid with their lives for trying to retrieve his commander's body, the others didn't venture out of their hiding places and retreated without identifying my position. But I knew that my own hiding place was no longer safe, and like a ghost, I promptly disappeared into the undergrowth. During my daily long-range reconnaissance and sniper hunting trips to enemy positions, I saw that the enemy's troop strength was steadily increasing. My reports and those of other snipers became important fragments in the mosaic of German intelligence that made it possible to determine the main direction of the approaching attack. At 8:00 a.m. on the morning of September 26, 1943, hundreds of flashes illuminated the horizon in the east with an irritating, shuddering light. A rumble and roar reached the German positions, which pressed more and more unbearably on the ears as it approached. In a moment, it seemed to the German fighters that the mouth of hell had opened before them. With the roar of a single explosion of unbelievable force, the shells of hundreds of artillery pieces and multiple rocket launchers rained down upon them. Shrapnel buzzed from the sky, and it was hard to breathe because of the clods of earth, gas, and dust that filled the air. After the first wave of explosions, the heart-rending screams of the wounded and maimed began to echo from all sides. The infantrymen pressed desperately into their trenches and rifle cells. Short prayers were said, whispered or shouted, silent vows were made. Soldiers who had been seized by hysteria were dragged back into their trenches by their comrades. And minutes that seemed like hours began. The ground shook from the blows and explosions of shells. The air turned into a suffocating mixture of dirt, gas, and metal dust, from which the soldiers almost lost their breath. Huddled on the ground in my cell, I felt as helpless as a small child. I forced myself to mutter the Lord's Prayer over and over again, now and then breaking into desperate pleas for God's protection. Mother of God, why me, God? Help me get out of this alive. Help me. Help me. Our Father who art in heaven. Suddenly I was stunned by a terrible explosion, and for a moment I lost my orientation in space. A huge lump of earth and some dark object flew over my foxhole. Instinctively I pressed my head to my knees and pressed myself harder into the bottom of my cell. A moment later, something thudded, landing in the dirt beside me. I jerked backward, horrified. It was the mangled remains of my comrade who occupied the next cell, a torso with severed limbs. Shrapnel had turned his chest, neck, and face into a quivering, bloody mess. But his mouth, which was surprisingly unharmed, suddenly began to emit guttural moans and spoke as if from another world. What's wrong with me? What has happened? Why is it so suddenly dark? Why can't I feel my body? The mangled stumps of his arms and legs, torn off at the hips, twitched helplessly. Help me, please. The words of his plea came out with a strange gurgling sound. Panic gripped me. On the verge of hysteria, I pressed myself into the wall of the trench so as not to touch the mangled body. Paralyzed, unable to move, I couldn't take my eyes off the dying man, who screamed shrilly. I'm blind. Ah, 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 blind. Ah, 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 ah. Where are my hands? Ah. Convulsively twitching, the torso began to wriggle in the mud. I thought I was going to lose my mind, and suddenly I was trembling. I started mentally yelling, "God, let him die. God damn it. God damn it. Let him die. Why won't he die?" My mortally wounded comrade screamed louder and louder, and finally, with a wild howl of "ah," the mangled stumps of his torso twitched convulsively for the last time and fell silent forever. As if hypnotized, I could not take my eyes off the bloody body for the few minutes during which I tried to calm down. Shells fired from tanks and heavy mortars were falling all around me, but I did not notice it. Half an hour had passed since the Russian artillery preparation began, an eternity for the German fighters, and it was over. The Soviet infantry went on the attack. The growing rumble of the tracks of the approaching Russian tanks' tracks could be heard, mingling with the shouts of the advancing infantry. It took the German gunners only seconds to regain consciousness. Medics began treating the seriously wounded, and the lightly wounded and remaining unharmed Wehrmacht soldiers raised their weapons over the edges of the trenches and began returning Russian fire. I was almost ecstatic at this opportunity to release the tension. Enraged and without thinking of the danger, I rushed into battle to stop going crazy. It was as if I was freeing myself from the nightmare I had lived through. The sniper's hour had come again. Shot after shot, with murderous accuracy, my bullets found their target in the ranks of the enemy. The heat of battle became just wild. On the front line, Russian fighters mixed with German. The barrel of my rifle became so hot that the grease that protected the weapon from rusting between the barrel and the stock began to melt and run down my fingers. Shells exploded around me, and shrapnel cut through the air with a howl. I instinctively changed my position, and jumping from one trench to another, quickly picked up the ammunition of the dead Russians. I also had to take care not to be cut off from my unit. The connection between this Russian offensive and their breakthrough in the lower reaches of the Dnieper was unclear to the ordinary German soldier. For me, the whole strategic situation was reduced to a simple struggle for survival. The battle raged for 8 days, during which the defensive positions and counterattacks constantly replaced each other. German companies and regiments were steadily losing numbers, but were not being replenished. At the first aid stations, operations were going on day and night, and endless streams of medics dumped buckets of human tissue and amputated limbs into the garbage pits behind the operating tents. Hundreds of soldiers groaned and screamed as they lay waiting for medical attention. Many of them died as the doctors did not have time to deal with the hopeless. Some were lucky enough to meet death, sedated with morphine, but most died alone and in agony. Many severely wounded who had no hope of recovery were killed right on the battlefield by their comrades. And this was considered lucky, as otherwise they risked being found by the enemy. Poor treatment of the wounded was another feature of military everyday life. The sniper's hour had come again. Shot after shot, with murderous accuracy, my bullets found their target in the ranks of the enemy. The heat of battle became just wild. On the front line, Russian fighters mixed with German. The barrel of my rifle became so hot that the grease that protected the weapon from rusting between the barrel and the stock began to melt and run down my fingers. Shells exploded around me, and shrapnel cut through the air with a howl. I instinctively changed my position, and jumping from one trench to another, quickly picked up the ammunition of the dead Russians. I'd also had to take care not to be cut off from my unit. The connection between this Russian offensive and their breakthrough in the lower reaches of the Dnieper was unclear to the ordinary German soldier. For me, the whole strategic situation was reduced to a simple struggle for survival. The battle raged for 8 days, during which the defensive positions and counterattacks constantly replaced each other. German companies and regiments were steadily losing numbers but were not being replenished. At the first aid stations, operations were going on day and night, and endless streams of medics dumped buckets of human tissue and amputated limbs into the garbage pits behind the operating tents. Hundreds of soldiers groaned and screamed as they lay waiting for medical attention. Many of them died as the doctors did not have time to deal with the hopeless. Some were lucky enough to meet death, sedated with morphine, but most died alone and in agony. Many severely wounded who had no hope of recovery were killed right on the battlefield by their comrades. and this was considered lucky, as otherwise they risked being found by the enemy. The mistreatment of the wounded was another feature of military everyday life. The smell of gunpowder, sweat, blood, fear, and death hovered over the battlefield and forever permeated the minds of the soldiers. I, a 19-year-old boy, in this environment lost my youthful maximalism and carefree outlook on life. Like many of my peers, I took it as a given that the enemy must pay as dearly as possible for my life, and in this field I developed a professionalism surprising for such a young man. I held my nerve when others panicked. I used my weapons with extreme precision, like a surgical instrument. The instinct to survive in combat was so evident in me that living in the rhythm of constantly alternating between defense, seeking cover, and attacking became second nature to me. I was known for not being afraid of injury or death, and that's called courage. And I had the requisite amount of luck. Here before us is one of the mysteries of war. Some soldiers seem conspired against death or injury. I was one of them. I managed to survive in spite of the fact that I was always in the thick of the bloodiest events. On October 4-5, the intensity of the fighting finally eased, giving the exhausted company a few days to regroup. On October 9, 1943, the Red Army troops attacked the remnants of the 3rd Mountain Division with 20 times superior forces. At 10:00 a.m., the obligatory artillery preparation began, for which 400 Russian artillery pieces and 220 multiple rocket launchers, firing more than 15,000 shells per hour, were employed. What was happening filled the German infantrymen with a terror that drove them mad. But when the artillery preparation was over, they rose like ghosts from the sulfurous vapor and turned earth to defend their positions with desperate courage. This example clearly shows that a true soldier is all about self-control, combat experience, grit, and determination to fight to the end. The Soviet attack hit the German positions like a tidal wave. The manpower reserves of the Russians seemed almost inexhaustible, while the Wehrmacht units were steadily dwindling in numbers due to lack of replenishment. Their enemy's troop strength was steadily increasing. The Japanese decision to focus their attention on the South Pacific meant that the Russians could withdraw their numerous troops from Siberia and also engage them in the Western theater of operations. In addition, every male between the ages of 14 and 60 was drafted into the Soviet army, with no exceptions. However, many of the Russian units were created extremely hastily and, in fact, turned out to be cannon fodder. Their soldiers wore civilian clothes under their uniform jackets, and their training was reduced to only 2 days of training, during which the recruits barely had time to learn how to use small arms. Their recruitment and organization was so rushed that not even every one of them had enough weapons. The command, having calculated the expected casualties in the coming attack, armed only those who were to be in the first wave of the attack. The soldiers who followed them were left without weapons and had to pick them up from the fallen. Therefore, it is understandable that such fighters feared like fire to be sent into battle, but even greater was the fear of punishment for disobeying orders. The Soviet fighters were mercilessly forced to fight by the NKVD troops marching behind them. In this battle, I saw for the first time how the Russians shot their deserters, or rather, anyone who started to retreat, and how they forced the fighters without the slightest pity to break through well-defended positions. One wave of attackers after another fell upon the German trenches, only to be shot down like rabbits. As a result, literally walls of bodies of dead and wounded Russian fighters formed around the positions of the mountain riflemen. New waves of attackers were forced to climb over the corpses of their fallen comrades, using their bodies as cover, until the mountains of bodies became so high that the attack itself began to choke before this diabolical obstacle. Then the Russians threw tanks into the attack, which drove right over the corpses and the still surviving wounded comrades. The tracks of the T-34 tanks kneaded the bodies with a rumbling sound, and human bones crunched like dry wood with a crunch. These sounds were mixed with the screams and groans of wounded soldiers. It was unbearable to hear and watch all this. The battle was heating up with renewed vigor. The German gunners fought like mad, hoping in the heat of the battle to throw out of their minds everything they had seen. When they ran out of ammunition, they rushed at the enemy with bayonets and shovels. The anger and determination of the Wehrmacht soldiers defending their positions was so strong that as dusk fell, the Russians had to call off the attack. I was attached to a company commander, which meant that I had to be in the thick of the fighting all the time. The distance between me and the enemy often decreased so rapidly that after a few aimed shots I had to put down my sniper rifle and pull out my MP-40 submachine gun, which I always had ready and hanging on my back during such situations. Battles of this kind always turned out to be very difficult for me, because the fighters on the front lines of defense very quickly mixed with the attackers. Close combat began, and at distances of about 30 meters the telescopic sight became useless and significantly narrowed the view. It was attached to the rifle in such a way that it was almost impossible to aim without looking through the scope. In such situations, a sniper is always under tremendous stress. On the one hand, he cannot drop his rifle with telescopic sight. On the other hand, if the enemy spots him with it, the sniper is in extreme danger, because the enemy immediately starts firing at him particularly intensively. I was attached to the company commander, which meant that I had to be in the thick of the fighting all the time. The distance between me and the enemy often decreased so rapidly that after a few aimed shots I had to put down my sniper rifle and pull out my MP-40 submachine gun, which I always had ready and hanging on my back during such situations. Battles of this kind always turned out to be very difficult for me, because the fighters on the front lines of defense very quickly mixed with the attackers. Close combat began, and at distances of about 30 meters the telescopic sight became useless and significantly narrowed the view. It was attached to the rifle in such a way that it was almost impossible to aim without looking through the scope. In such situations, a sniper is always under tremendous stress. On the one hand, he cannot drop his rifle with telescopic sight. On the other hand, if the enemy spots him with it, the sniper is in extreme danger, because the enemy immediately starts firing at him particularly intensively. When by evening the battle had quieted down, the surviving German gunners could not afford to relax. It was obvious that the Russians would soon regroup and launch another attack. My comrades had only a few hours' respite before the assault resumed. This time it was with less pressure, the enemy trying not to get too close. And it was now that the snipers made a tangible contribution to the defense of the positions with their accurate shots, which they used to hit targets from afar. On the night of October 10 to 11 in my sector, the Russians suddenly stopped firing, and in a few minutes there was a deceptive silence. The commander of the 7th Company took the opportunity to make a quick detour around his men's positions to get to grips with the situation. At the machine gunner's position, which stood out a little in front of the main line of defense, he received a report of suspicious movements in the bushes in front of it. The commander immediately sent out a patrol of 8 experienced soldiers. I accompanied them as a guard, cautiously crawling 30 meters away from them. I had my sniper rifle with me, and the infantrymen of the patrol were armed with submachine guns and hand grenades. They crawled through knee-high grass to the spot indicated by the machine gunners, their nerves strained to the limit. As we moved forward about 300 meters, we heard muffled voices. On the patrol commander's signal, I took a well-camouflaged position behind some nearby bushes, set up my rifle in a firing position, and began to view the terrain through the telescopic sight. Right in front of me, at a distance of 80 meters, I saw a gentle slope of a deep ravine. The patrol approached its edge. The patrol commander cautiously peered into the ravine and saw a Russian detachment of about 100 soldiers, consisting of old men and teenagers, sitting on the ground rather tightly together, talking and smoking, trying to overcome fear and not to think about their dangerous situation. They were being led by an obviously inexperienced officer. The patrol commander crawled back and gestured to his men to explain the situation. One of them crawled to me and told me that they, despite the numerical superiority of the enemy, wanted to try to carry out a surprise attack as soon as it began to dawn. The German fighters expected that the Russians, caught by surprise, would instinctively flee and rush to the gentle slope of the ravine, where I could shoot them. 2 hours later, the first pale morning rays glimmered on the horizon. Many of the Russians were asleep by this time, their sentries struggling with fatigue and looking distracted. At the sign of the patrol commander, each German fighter drew 3 hand grenades and activated them. As if appearing out of nowhere, 24 grenades exploded among the unsuspecting Russians. At the same moment, there was absolute panic among them. They began to scatter in all directions, firing wildly and hitting each other. The wounded began to scream in terror. The German patrol above the ravine opened fire on the confused crowd with their submachine guns. Exactly as the mountain gunners expected, the Russians rushed up the gentle slope of the ravine directly into the range of my fire. Following the ruthless laws of war, I did what I had to do. My actions were almost automatic. I aimed at the center of the torso and squeezed the trigger. I took quick aim and fired again and again. Bullet after bullet found its target with extreme accuracy. In a few moments, 5 Russians were lying in the grass with fatal wounds. The others were dazed. I reloaded my rifle, and soon 5 more were killed. The Soviet fighters, pushing each other, ran backward only to be destroyed by the patrol's bullets and grenades. This went on for a few more minutes, and the carnage was over. Corpses and wounded, screaming and dying Russians lay everywhere. Without a sound, I and the patrol, like ghosts, disappeared into the semi-darkness of dawn. There was not a scratch on us. A few days later, during which the regiment could only partially restore its defenses, the German riflemen were again struck in full force by a new Russian offensive. Again, this meant a relentless struggle for survival. Despite rare German successes in counterattacks, the numerical superiority of the Russians soon made itself felt, and the Wehrmacht soldiers had to abandon their positions under their pressure. Nevertheless, the capture of German positions was extremely haphazard, and the front line constantly fluctuated until it came to the point where there was no defined front line at all. Communications between German units were cut. The results of the fighting became unclear, and each unit seemed to be fighting for itself. Psychologically, this was a unique situation in which the instability of the front, the immense pressure of bloody fighting, and the constant fear of being cut off created a huge risk of panic starting. However, indiscriminate flight would lead the German troops to disaster and annihilation, as the enemy would then be able to advance without encountering any serious resistance, and entire units of the Wehrmacht would be annihilated. Thus, the German army would have suffered enormous losses in men and material. At the same time, panic is something deeply human. It is embedded in instincts and is the last chance to save oneself from danger. However, at the same time, panic means the rejection of organized and united resistance, and, in fact, puts an end to the existence of a military unit as such. And if panic embraces the bulk of the fighters, it is impossible to stop it. In this case, it takes an almost superhuman will to remain firm and control the urge to flee. Now, after 2 days of incessant fighting, culminating in hand-to-hand combat with shovels and rifle butts, the first signs of panic appeared among the mountain gunners. Individual soldiers thought about fleeing the front lines, and some of them, succumbing to despair, actually did so. As soon as the panic began to grow, officers and NCOs began to fight hard against it, setting by their own actions shining examples of courage and will to fight. They could only prevent the disintegration of their unit by leading from the front line and fighting shoulder to shoulder with their men. In the 3rd Mountain Division, this style of leadership was part of its fighting character, and it ensured its survival as a cohesive formation until the very last day of the war. But back to me. In the midst of the carnage, I watched, mesmerized by the horror of what was happening, as 2 Russians jumped into a nearby trench, where several of my comrades were at that moment. The German gunners seemed paralyzed with fear, but one of them still instinctively rushed with a shovel in his hands at one of the Russians and cut his face open. The other Russian, however, was masterly with the bayonet. With cat-like fluidity of movement, he parried every attack of the remaining 6 German soldiers. I was raring to help my comrades, searching in vain for an opportunity to shoot accurately into the tangle of fighters who were fighting in hand-to-hand combat. I could only watch as one by one my comrades were stabbed to death. It seemed as if fate itself had left them to the skill and ruthless determination of the Russian. Instead of pouncing on him all at once, my comrades allowed themselves to be finished off one by one. They acted as if they had given up hope of survival. And this continued until the Russian knocked down the very last gunner and swung to kill him. But I managed to stop the Soviet soldier with an accurate shot. The surviving German fighter, not fully believing in the reality of what was happening, looked up when, right in front of him, a bullet tore apart the enemy's face. Shards of bone and scraps of tissue splattered my comrade, his face, and uniform. At that moment the will to live, awakened by the unexpected rescue, returned to him. Leaping out of the trench, the German gunner crawled into the trench toward me. This episode clearly reflected one of the inner qualities necessary for a sniper. To a much greater extent than the ability to shoot accurately, he needs the special gift of self-control, which allows him to react in time and act with automaticity even in situations that seem hopeless. As integral to a sniper's skill as the ability to find a target and make accurate shots as it may seem, the ability to handle a weapon just as competently during infantry combat is far more important. Snipers who possessed it always proved to be better fighters than soldiers who were only well trained in the technical and theoretical aspects of their craft. Young snipers who were brought to the front immediately after their training and had no experience always managed to fire only about 15 or 20 shots before they became the target of heavy enemy fire. Their most fatal mistakes were the awkward choice of position, which did not permit rapid and unobtrusive exit, the unwillingness to avoid enemy fire, and firing too long from one position. A sniper whose location was spotted was always bombarded by the fire of heavy infantry guns, such as mortars, and if he had no way to escape unnoticed, all he had to do was run across the open space as fast as he could. Among German snipers, this was called hair jumping, because in such cases the sniper had to suddenly jump out of his cell and run to a new position chosen in advance, making desperate and unpredictable zigzags for the enemy. Such a run under enemy fire requires tremendous willpower and very strong nerves. Inexperienced soldiers usually preferred to stay in their positions rather than take such risks, and inevitably lost their lives as a result. No matter how bravely the 3rd Mountain Division fought, but the Red Army units penetrated so deeply into its defense lines in the south that it faced the threat of encirclement. The Russians had driven a wedge firmly into the German front and were now ready to deliver a decisive blow. At the last moment, just before the start of their final assault, on October 31, 1943, the order to retreat behind the Dnieper arrived. In doing so, however, the German army was to maintain a bridgehead around the manganese mines near Nikopol so that the supply of their products to Germany could continue for as long as possible. This bridgehead was to be held by the 3rd Mountain Division and 8 other divisions. They were all battle-weary and reduced to a quarter of their regular strength. They had only 3 weeks to prepare their positions and organize their defenses. The divisions received a meager supply that included, among other things, new winter uniforms. These were double-sided cotton suits with thick bake lining, consisting of a double-breasted top jacket and top pants. One side of the suits was white for use in winter conditions, and the other side was camouflage for other seasons. However, the initial enthusiasm of the soldiers who received these warm garments quickly faded. The thin fabric on the outside of the suits quickly ripped, and the lining began to absorb moisture, after which the uniforms not only became heavy, but also ceased to protect from the cold. In frosty weather, the wet lining even froze. The same thing happened with the new leather and felt boots. Soon the infantrymen faced another problem. The material of which the lining was made turned out to be an almost ideal habitat for lice, which hid in it from the pursuit of their masters. Over the winter, the suits became so full of lice that they were washed with them at the beginning of spring. Not only that, the German riflemen soon discovered that the suits could be used only in dry cold, and even then, when they did not have to move around too much. The point is that the suits were worn over field uniforms, and when soldiers sweated, the sweat could not dry quickly on the thick fabric. As a result, the number of colds and flu cases increased dramatically. Not surprisingly, when the division began to retreat at the end of the cold spell, its entire route was marked by hundreds of discarded winter suits. Such trails the 3rd Mountain Division left for the rest of the war. The infantrymen were convinced by bitter experience that thick underwear, capes, and raincoats were much more reliable than such winter suits. In the spring of 1944, I managed to convince the regimental tailor to make me a camouflage shirt, which served me reliably for a long time. In the same way, I got a light white suit for camouflage in the snow, which could be rolled up so that it took up very little space and was easy to carry. The thin cotton fabric of this suit did not restrain the sniper's movements, even when it got wet. In addition, like the camouflage shirt, it dried very quickly. For a while the fighting was reduced to patrols and sniper sorties. I went out hunting every day to create an atmosphere of unease in the Russian trenches. For my purposes, I adapted a tank that had been shot down and was standing on neutral ground between the Russian and German positions. I climbed under it before dawn, and while under its protection during the day, viewed the Russian positions and fired at them through the gap between the tank's tracks. Unusually, I used this cover for 4 days, during which time I increased my sniper score by 5 hits. I felt perfectly safe in my position under the steel colossus, since the Russians had no heavy guns, and I was quite consciously breaking the iron law of snipers, not to stay too long in the same place. But the Russians soon became incredibly cautious, and it became difficult for me to find a target. Then on the 5th day, I decided to take an observer with me. The choice fell on Baldwin Moser, a Tyrolean whom I had befriended a few weeks before. As we made our way before sunrise to the sunken tank, we had no idea of the nightmare we were about to endure in the coming hours. Neither of us felt the proximity of the terrible death that fate had in store for the observer. I was confident in the safety of my position, although I had fired from it many times. The Soviets did not yet have artillery on this section of the front, and the armor of a hit tank could protect from everything else. Or rather, almost everything. I did not suspect that a much greater danger awaited me. A Russian sniper who knew his business, as well as I did. The fiery red morning sun appeared in the east, sending its first rays over the vast steppe as Baldwin and I positioned ourselves under the tank and began to look over the enemy positions for careless prey. Baldwin raised his binoculars only a little higher than they should have been, but the faint glow from his lenses was enough to tell the Russian sniper that his enemy had occupied his lair. Once in his well-camouflaged position, the Russian set his rifle in firing position and waited carefully for another glare. Less than a minute later, he fired a shot. It was at that moment that he was also noticed by Baldwin, who whispered, "Hey, Joseph there, 2 fingers away from the hillock. Move." A second resounding thud immediately followed the first, and behind me there was a sound like a clap of hands. Blood and scraps of cloth splattered the left side of my face. I turned to Baldwin and saw the monstrous grimace on his face. A Russian sniper's bullet had ricocheted off the observer's binoculars and ripped his mouth open, tearing off his lips, teeth, chin, and half his tongue. Baldwin stared at me with panicked eyes, his torn mouth gurgling with a strange gurgle of foaming blood. I immediately crawled deep under the tank, dragging Baldwin by the legs behind me. It was impossible to leave the position before dark, for that would mean certain death at the hands of an enemy sniper. So we were doomed to wait. I felt helpless and could not help my badly wounded comrade. Neither bandages nor pressure bandages could help. Baldwin's only hope for salvation was the prompt and qualified assistance of professional physicians. But where was that to be found? All I could do was watch as the fragment of my friend's tongue swelled to the size of a child's ball, gradually closing off his airway. I tried to press Baldwin's tongue against the edge of his mouth, but it made the observer nauseous and gave him even less air. He could only be saved by jamming his tongue into some kind of cylinder or cutting it off. and there was nothing left for me to do but watch the futile struggle for my comrade's life. On the combat account of the author of this book, 257 Lives of Soviet Soldiers. This is a memoir of one of the best sharpshots, snipers, Wehrmacht. This is a cynical revelations of a ruthless professional about the terrible cruelty of war on the Eastern Front, in which there was no room for either chivalry or compassion. In July 1943, a young machine gunner, Joseph Alderberg, was wounded near Voroshilovsky. In the hospital, he decided to experiment with a Russian sniper rifle that happened to fall into his hands. A few months later, he returned to his regiment as a trained marksman and changed his military specialty forever. In the days when the Nazis had to continuously retreat under the blows of the Red Army, Alderberg became one of the most successful German snipers. Cunning and ruthless, possessing inhuman endurance and animal-like ability to navigate the battlefield, he survived the most terrible battles of the Eastern Front, but paid a monstrous price for his survival, turning into a complete killer.